What do you rely on in those big moments in life? Do you know what I mean when I say those big moments? I mean those game day moments when it's on. When life is coming at you, it's coming at you hard, it's coming at you fast, and it feels like the foreseeable future depends on how you deal with what's on your plate at the moment. There's something big. How do you handle those times? What is it you rely on in those moments? Maybe it's moving home. Maybe it's starting a new job or making a big life decision. Perhaps it's having a baby or working through a life-changing illness. Maybe it's facing down the barrel of severe financial circumstances. What do you rely on at those times? Is it time to retreat into Zen mode, go to your happy place, try and find some distractions and pretend it's not happening and just, I'll take a moment and everything will be fine? Or maybe it's panic stations. Maybe you stay awake at nights thinking about how on earth am I going to get through this thing? Maybe you know that you have to work hard, and so you work hard and you have to do it. You have to be the one to make it work if it's going to happen. If you're going to sort out this problem, you're going to ride it out, well, you better work at it. I think both of us, all of us, would agree that neither of those options are particularly healthy options. And so we might be tempted to a third option. It's a lot like the first one, actually. It's just the Christian version of it. And it goes a little like this. It goes, let go and let God. Yeah, we've heard that one, haven't we? Just chill. God's got this one. Just let go. Relax, sit back, and let God just take you on this ride. Let go and let God. And there's something I like about that. It's an acknowledgement that God is in control, absolutely. And it's an acknowledgement that we can rest in him because he's got us. And that's great, and that's true. But I don't think it's quite right. It's not quite all there. It's not fully fleshed out. It captures something of the truth of the sovereignty of God, but it fails to address the other side of that coin, which is man's responsibility. In Esther chapter 7, we see something of how God's sovereignty works with and intersects with man's responsibility. How should we look at these seemingly giant and difficult moments in our life? What should we be relying on when it comes to those moments? And how do we rely on the thing we're relying on? Well, let's have a look at what's going on here in Esther chapter 7. I think it'll answer some questions for us. Well, if you've been following along with the story of Esther week by week as we've been going through it, you're anticipating chapter 7. It's kicking off, isn't it? It's all happening now in chapter 7. We reach this moment where just about everything comes to light. As the audience, we have been aware of what's been going on as the pieces have been being maneuvered. We've known all along who Esther really is. We've known her identity. We've known her relationship with Mordecai. And we know how she's been maneuvering herself. And the whole time, the suspense of the story has been, how is the king going to react? That's what we've been waiting to see. How's the king going to react? How's Haman going to react? What's he going to do? Well, now we find out. Finally, the time had come for Esther to reveal all. When the king asked her this time, what is it you want, Esther? Just tell me. Well, she's ready to answer him now. She's played her cards, she's built up her hand, and she's ready to... You can't play your cards and build up your hand. That was a really bad use of language there. Never mind, I'll go in the sermon review later. She's ready to answer him. So we get to verse 1. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. This is the second time they've done this now. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favour in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. It may be crunch time, it may be all happening, but Esther keeps her cool. And she's very careful about how she chooses her words. She's working very hard here to manipulate and work the situation. She says, "Oh, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king," she's being respectful. And she's doing it in such a way that reminds him that he is favorable towards her. She is his favorite wife. He does love her. And she's really emphasizing that it is on these grounds that you should grant my request. If I please you, which I do, grant my request, O king. And so her request then is simple. It's very simple. It's, if I please you, if I found favor in your sight, spare my life and the life of my people. So at this point, this is a kind of an important moment. Esther, as it were, comes far enough out of the closet to link her fate with the fate of her people. She's saying, my life is in danger, and so is the lives of my people. She's linking her life with theirs. If they are destroyed, then she's going to be destroyed. If they are spared, she's spared. But do you notice? She doesn't go so far as to tell him who her people are. It's really smart. It's really clever. But then again, Haman never actually revealed to the king who the people were that he wanted to get killed. When Haman goes to the king in chapter 3, verse 8, asking him basically to try and get him to kill the Jews, all he said is this. It's in verse 8. "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that there is not to the king profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." He never tells the king who he's talking about, and King Ahasuerus just signs off on this. Yeah, sure, I don't really care who they are, just slay them. I got 10,000 talents of silver, thank you very much. And so Esther plays a similar game here. She's very crafty, she's very cunning, and I don't mean that negatively. She's very clever, and she should be applauded for what she achieves here. She's very careful with her words, and she engineers the situation as best she can for herself and for her people. She reminds the king how pleased he is with her. And then having done that, she ties her fate to the fate of her people, knowing that he'll care more about her than he will about her people. And the whole time she never actually mentions who those people are. But she's beginning to get the king on side. She's beginning to get him to agree with her without him ever realizing what he's about to have to agree to. That it would mean going against his own word and his own decree. She's beginning to get the king on side, but she doesn't stop there. Not yet. She continues and she backs up her request with some reasons. Why was it necessary for the king to step in and save Esther and her people? Well, because she and her people had been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. We might think, Esther, you're going over the top here. Why are you using these words? Well, she's using the words from the king's edict, word for word. Destroyed, killed, annihilated. And I reckon at this point, Haman's probably starting to sweat. I think he's beginning to realize what's going on. Haman starts to worry as he sees the king's rage begin to bubble. Esther's buttered up the king. She makes sure that he understands the only reason she's even bothering to mention. I wouldn't even bother to mention this, "O Lord, my king," if it was just a matter of that little old thing of slavery. You know, we wouldn't want to inconvenience with you with that little small thing. If it was just slavery, I wouldn't even mention it. But I might be killed, my lord, and I know how much you like me, so I'm just mentioning it for your sake. It's very well thought through, isn't it? It's a genius move. She's working hard. She's doing what she can. She's made her point without ever giving him the details. And she's made the king angry because he's going to lose his favourite wife. And she's never actually yet revealed who the target is. It's worked. The arguments hit home. And the king's anger was stirred. And he responds then with a final question. Who is he? And where is he who has dared to do this? And Naaman's going, oh no. However, the tempting answer for Esther to give might have been the same answer that the prophet Nathan gave to King David. You know that story? When David has slept with Bathsheba and Nathan comes, he tells him this little parable about a shepherd who has one sheep and another shepherd who has 100 sheep, and the one with 100 sheep takes the one lamb, and David's like, that's disgusting. Who is this man? And Nathan goes, well, you're the guy. Now, she could have done that, couldn't she? She could have, after she built up this little story without many details, who has done this? She could have said, well, you have actually, king. You're the man. Strictly speaking, Ahasuerus is the one who has done all of this in his name. He's the one with the power. He's the one with the responsibility. He's the one who has his name on the papers. But this wasn't the goal of her speech. This actually probably wouldn't have helped her cause. Not every injustice can be set right by earthly events. Some will have to wait till Judgment Day. So, instead of implicating the king and possibly losing him and his sympathy, she instead focuses the king's anger on the person who came up with this plan. A foe, an enemy, this man, Haman. See the blood drain from Haman's face. Elsewhere in Esther, Haman will be identified as Haman, the enemy of the Jews. But he's not identified in this way by Esther before the king, because that's not why he's an enemy of King Ahasuerus. He's not an enemy of King Ahasuerus because he's an enemy of the Jews, but because he's an enemy of the king's wife. And Haman is stunned into silence as this happens. He's stunned into silence before the king and the queen. Remember, he's the only guest at this banquet. It's just him, the king and the queen. There's no one for him to, oh, sorry, so how was the weather this, how's your week been? There's no escaping into conversation. There's no one to hide behind. He was terrified before the king and the queen. He'd been completely outsmarted by Esther, and he knew it. There was nothing he could say to the king in his defense. But the king still needed a moment to work out what to do. So in verse 7, the king arose from his wrath, from the wine drinking, and went into the palace garden. Why did the king take a break at this point? What was there to think about? It certainly wasn't because he'd lose any sleep over killing Haman. Indeed, by the way Haman responds, he's already pretty certain the king's going to kill him. No, the king wasn't concerned about Haman, but rather he was concerned for his own reputation. After all, it was the king himself who had approved Haman's plan. Ultimately, it was his name on the edict. So how could he punish Haman for the edict without losing face himself? How could he punish Haman for just doing actually what the king himself has done? How could he punish Haman without passing on judgment to himself? And for a man who cares about his ego, we've seen the way he reacts when his wife doesn't do what he wants. It's a tricky situation for the king. But thankfully, Haman makes it much easier for him. Because the king rose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. During the king's absence, Haman tries to beg for his life from Esther, even falling down at her feet, ultimately a fulfillment of what Haman's wife had warned him. Do you remember? She said, "If you pursue this, you will fall at the seed of the Jews." And here it is happening. Well, here he is. He's begging for his life from Esther. He's been defeated by Esther, the Jew. And he falls to the queen's feet, seemingly onto her couch, just as the king enters the room, giving the king exactly the excuse he needed to kill Haman. It was the political cover he needed. No one would question his actions when they find out that Haman was trying to make a move on the queen. Now, I don't think King Ahasuerus really, for one moment, seriously thought Haman was about to do that in front of him in his own house, but it was a convenient charge that diverted the attention from the real issue. And I love this little bit. And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. And I just love this idea, the guards at the side of the room just waiting, and as soon as the judgment is passed, they just put their hands over his mouth, put a bag over his head. As soon as judgment was given by the king, there was no room for reply from Haman. There was no arguing his corner, and no trying to explain himself. He was just gagged and taken out of the room, dragged out of the palace. And then to add insult to injury, verse 9, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, the gallows or the stake that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that they had prepared for Mordecai, then the wrath of the king abated. I wonder what Haman had done to upset Harbona that morning. Just saying, my lord, there's a great big gallows outside of Haman's place. You could use that. It's ready to go. Never been used, brand new. One careful owner. And just note, I just want to note here as well that we read gallows here and we hear of somebody being hanged and we think of a noose, don't we? But the word is probably not what it meant here. It's much more brutal. The word can mean stake. It's more likely that there was a great big stake that was outside of Haman's house on which they would impale the body. Much more fruity, isn't it? Hung out there for all to see. So Haman was taken out of the palace and his body was impaled on a massive pole that he himself had built for Mordecai just 24 hours before. What a difference a day makes, eh? So that's what's going on here. I said that this chapter, in it we see God's sovereignty and man's responsibility in how they interact. So we see it across a few chapters, but this is the crux of it. And I said that it's going to help us to understand how we go about the world, how we should understand our responsibility and how we should act in the world. Esther's intricate plan was a necessary part of the process of bringing Haman to justice, absolutely. It was a plan that required her to work hard, a plan that required a combination of subtlety and boldness and strength and courage to carry it through. And yet, Esther's plan alone is not what turned the fortune of God's people. I wonder if as we've read this far, what do you think is the event that the whole story hinges on? What is the pivotal moment in the book of Esther? For me and for many of the commentators, it's actually a chapter in which Esther isn't even mentioned until the last verse in passing. It's chapter 6. The pivotal moment of the book of Esther is chapter 6, verse 1, the king's sleepless night. Up to that point, up until the point of chapter 6, verse 1, the fortunes of the Jewish people were heading steadily downhill. Nothing was going right for them. Everything was going wrong for them. The king didn't even remember who Mordecai was, who'd done this amazing thing in saving his life. He'd signed the execution of the Jews without even caring to know who it was he was condemning. He didn't really know who these people were, and he didn't know why he should care about them. But from chapter 6, verse 1, from that moment, their prospects are transformed. Mordecai is remembered. The king is grateful to him. And all of a sudden, the Jewish people are on the radar of the king. He knows about them, and he's favourable towards them because of what he knows of Mordecai. Chapter 6, verse 1 is the key point in the story of Esther. We read that on that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. You remember that's when the story and the account of what Mordecai did for the king was reminded to the king, and he's like, oh, what did we ever do for him? And those things changed. It was at that point the prospects of the Jewish people began to change, and it comes about, doesn't it? Not by Esther's charm, not by Mordecai's work, but by a sleepless night. A sleepless night is what caused it. And who is it that the Bible tells us grants us sleep, or indeed keeps it from us? It's God, the Lord. Sleep is a gift from the Lord, and what a gift, eh? I mean, seriously, haven't had much of it recently, but what a gift. And as the one who gives this awesome gift, he can also withhold it. It was God and God alone who could give the king a sleepless night. He is the one who is at work in the pivotal moment of this book. And so again, although we never hear his name and we never hear his voice, we see it is God who is at work in the book of Esther, working for his people and working out his sovereign plans for to see his covenant fulfilled. The intricate plans that we lay can never come to fruition without God's sovereign providential blessing upon them. As Psalm 127 puts it, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labour in vain. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labour in vain. And yet this chapter also teaches us the complementary aspect of that truth, which is the builders still need to labour. You see that? The builders still need to labour. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labour in vain. But we still need to labour. It is significant that the pivotal moment of the book, chapter 6, in that chapter, Esther is absent. But that this chapter is bracketed by 5 and 7. And in those chapters, Esther's really busy at work. It shows her diligently using all the means at her disposal to bring about the desired end. She's working hard. God's sovereignty is ultimately the turning point, but God works through the faithful and even faithless efforts of his people. God's sovereignty and man's responsibility are not two separate things. They're not separate. They are linked. That's not to say that God is limited by our actions, but that he is at work through them. God works most often through means rather than miracles. God is at work in the world through the ordinary. It's not that we do our thing and we're doing it and we're doing our thing and we're getting on with it, and every now and again God will do something extravagant to nudge us back onto his sovereign plan. I think it's often how we think about it. We're just going through our day, we're doing our thing, but it's got nothing to do with God's plans. And then every now and again something big might happen in our lives which directs us to where God's really calling us, and we'll get where God wants us in the end. Often we think of our lives as, we're doing our work over here, just doing our thing, and God's working over here doing his thing. And every now and again God zaps what we're doing to make it efficient, to make it effective. He zaps us with some sovereignty, with some work of his hand, so that now we're in his will and now we're redirected, we're back on the path or whatever it may be. But that's not how God works. God works through us. God works through what we do. God is at work in what we do, and it's incredibly exciting. It's incredibly exciting. Day in, day out, the little things that we do, the seemingly insignificant, unimportant, everyday things, are some of the ways that God works out his sovereign will for our lives. So we've seen in Esther, haven't we? They have no clue. They're just going about their daily thing, doing their thing, but God's at work. They don't even see it. Take David, for example. When David killed Goliath, God could have just disintegrated Goliath, right? He could have. We're all agreed on that. I mean, when you think about it, why didn't he? Why didn't he? He could have just spoken a word and Goliath could have ceased to exist. But instead, God uses David to work out his sovereign will. And what does David do? David doesn't rock up like, well, let's have a shot at this and I'll throw a stick at him. And no, he goes down to the stream and he picks out 5 stones. 5 stones that he thinks, he's carefully picks them out from his daily experience of fighting off lions as being a shepherd. He picks 5 stones that he thinks will do the job. And then when he gets to Goliath, he looks at the 5 and then he picks the very best one of those 5. He's using his experience. He's using his knowledge to pick the best one to slay Goliath. And then he's worked really hard to choose the right stone, and then he works hard to load it in his sling correctly, to swing it at the right speed, and then to release his sling at the right time. Something he's perfected over years of shepherding. And that stone flies through the air perfectly and strikes Goliath and kills him. We could look at it one way and go, wow, David's really skilled. He knows what he's doing. He's worked hard. And yet David is clear. It is God who's given the victory. God has worked through him. It was because of God that he won. Ultimately, the effective element was God at work. You see, the sovereignty of God works not in God zapping Goliath. The sovereignty of God works out in David picking the right stone for the job. And that's more often than not how he works through our lives. God's sovereignty and our responsibility, our action, are not separate, unrelated truths. Do you want to see your friends come to Christ? Do you want to see your spouse saved? We can't reach their hearts and change them. Only God can do that. But we can and we should talk to them about Jesus. Introduce them to Christian friends. Invite them to church. Do we want to find God's leading in our lives? Progress may depend on him opening key doors for us, but there's nothing wrong in us getting out there and knocking on some doors. Do we want to have a better marriage? Unless God changes our hearts and the hearts of our spouse, we have no hope of lasting improvement. That doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. We don't sit back and wait for God to work if we are unwilling to put ourselves in pursuit of godly desires. Don't let go and let God. Trust God and get on. Most Christians err on one side or another of this equation. Some are the sit back and pray types whose motto is always leave it to Jesus. Those people, the tendency for them is to wait for God to drop a solution for all their problems in their laps, and by his grace sometimes he does that. Others have activist personalities and are constantly saying, well, if it's going to be, it's got to be me. For them, the tendency is to assume that the key to progress is following some three-step strategy. The key to progress is them getting on and doing it. The Bible, however, sets before us the goal of the balance of prayer plus action, of leaning on Christ and leading people to Christ, of resting in the Lord and walking with him. Either one on their own is inadequate. Both together are the goal. The truly wonderful part of God's sovereignty, though, is that even when we do get the balance wrong, yet he will still accomplish his will. Esther's the perfect example, isn't she? When we read Esther, where is her balance? Would we say she's the sit back and pray type or the get up and do? She's a get up and doer, isn't she? Not once does she rely on God, only on her skill and her ability, and yet God still delivers his people through Esther, despite her inadequate theology. God chose to deliver his people through Esther's activity, in spite of the absence of any explicit evidence of her prayerful dependence on him. It's a wonderful truth that God's sovereignty isn't dependent on you or I, but he does use us. And we should be open to be used by him. It's a wonderful truth. It's a truth that he will certainly deliver his people, whether or not they are faithful. See, God's action stems from his character, not from ours. And this is very good news. God acts for our good, not because we are good, not because we are worthy or we are deserving, but because he is good and gracious and kind and full of mercy and love. As Paul reminded Timothy, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. Why? Because he cannot deny himself. All of God's goodness is based on his character. This is why the doctrines, the teaching of the character of God is so important. We need to know who he is, because everything that stems from him is an outworking of who he is. And although we are not worthy, and although we are faithless, he gives us worth, and he is faithful to us. As we read Esther, it was possible to be certain all along that Haman, we knew he would never ultimately triumph. Not because we've read it before, but not because we are aware of the cunning of Esther, but because our confidence is in God's covenant promises to Abraham and his seed. There's no way Haman was going to win when it comes up against God's promises to his people. Likewise, for our churches, we can have great hope that God will do great things through our churches. Not because of the vast wisdom and ability of our elders, nor because of the gifts that abides in our pastors. Let me tell you, if we hope on these things, we might as well shut the doors now. We could perhaps draw a crowd with those things. We could perhaps put on a service and put on programs, but with just those things, we wouldn't be able to have a ministry that affects any real change in the hearts of men and women. That only happens through the powerful work of the Holy Spirit. Rather than resting on resources, our confidence rests on God's promise to build his church in such a way that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And still, we cannot sit idly by waiting for God to bring the multitudes into church. We are to be as skilled and as active as we can be in presenting the good news to our neighbours and friends. We also pray with boldness, knowing that God will surely accomplish through his church exactly what he wants to accomplish, despite our many sins and shortcomings. Just as importantly, we can have hope in our struggles with sin. Our hopes lie not in our own progress or our own personal strength, not at all. We cannot pull ourselves up by our own efforts. We can't stop sinning just by willpower. And the further we progress and the further we mature in the Christian life, the more evident that truth becomes, right? That as we grow in spiritual maturity, we see not less sin, but we see more sin in our lives. We see the deceitfulness of our hearts ever more clearly. And yet we can have confidence that we will make progress in godliness, because God has promised his Holy Spirit to be at work in our lives and in our hearts, generating his fruits of righteousness and holiness in us. The work may not progress as fast as we wish, but its progress is assured because God has promised it. We are not to simply sit back and say, let go and let God. We are to strive with every fibre of our being towards the holiness for which God has designed us. Because once again, we do so with confidence, knowing that God will work his righteousness in us on the day we stand before him. In the meantime, he will use our awareness of our sin to drive us again and again to the cross for his in thanksgiving. As we become aware of our sin, we're driven to the cross with thanksgiving for his patience and his grace and his mercy and his love. So how do you operate in the world, particularly when there are big things on your plate? Perhaps you're an Esther. Perhaps you think it's all down to you. Perhaps your tendency is to rely on yourself and your own actions. Well, the good news is that God will work his purposes through you regardless. But you will miss out on his blessing. God will not be stumped by you, but you will miss out on his blessing if you continue to rest on yourself. You will miss out on his assurance and his comfort and his help. And just as a note, just as a side note, and it's an unpopular side note perhaps, but I just want to raise the question. I'm not going to fully answer it, but I know that's helpful, right? But was Esther even saved? Was Esther even saved? There is no mention of Esther having faith. There's no mention of her expressing any faith or any action of faith in the whole of the book of Esther. She's not mentioned anywhere in Scripture. Sorry? She did fast, but she didn't. It wasn't towards God, seemingly. It seems to be an empty practice. Like I say, we don't know for certain, but there's no evidence of faith in Esther. She's not mentioned in Hebrews 11 as a hero of the faith, along with some other people who we might think she would have been, of everything she achieved. I'm not saying for certain that she wasn't, but equally I'm just saying we can't say for sure that she was, and yet God used her. You can be busy around God's work. You can be busy around God's people, never ask for his help, and never be saved. It isn't what you do that saves you. It's knowing Jesus. It's having faith. Maybe you're not an Esther. Maybe you're a leave it to Jesus type. Maybe you're lazy. Maybe you use the sovereignty of God as a cover for laziness and apathy. Don't just let go and let God. For sure, you won't hinder God's plans, but you may be being disobedient, and you may be missing out on his blessing, and you may miss out on being used for something incredible. So trust God and work hard. Pray and invite people to church. Commit your life to God and then work at pursuing his glory. Pray for his help and then work at pursuing holiness. Ask for his guidance and then prayerfully do something. The one thing I want you to go away with tonight is don't just let go and let God. Equally, don't run around like a headless chicken trying to do it all yourself. But trust God and then get on. Amen.